Hey there! Tonight, we're stepping into some of history's stranger corners. Not the glorious battles or grand discoveries, but the peculiar, often disturbing ways people tried to survive, cure illness, and make a living. We'll explore why Europeans ground up ancient Egyptian corpses and consumed them as medicine, why hat makers went mad from mercury poisoning, and what sailors really ate when their provisions ran out at sea. If this kind of calm, strange history helps you unwind, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it actually brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always oddly comforting to know who else is drifting off to these same bizarre tales from the past. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin with perhaps the strangest medical practice in European history: eating the dead. The mummy eaters. When ancient corpses became medicine in the apothecary shops of 16th and 17th century Europe, nestled between jars of herbs and vials of oils, sat something far more unsettling: fragments of brown, desiccated flesh, powdered bone, chunks of what had once been human tissue, carefully preserved and priced by the ounce. This was mumia, and for centuries, it was considered essential medicine. The wealthy took it for headaches. The sick consumed it for internal bleeding. Kings kept personal supplies. And almost no one questioned the fundamental strangeness of grinding up ancient Egyptian corpses and swallowing them as cure-alls. This wasn't a fringe practice whispered about in dark corners. This was mainstream medicine, prescribed by physicians, sold in respectable shops, and consumed by everyone from clergymen to royalty. But how did Europe arrive at this peculiar form of medical cannibalism? The answer lies in a series of mistranslations, misunderstandings, and the medieval tendency to assume that if something was ancient and foreign, it must possess magical properties. The word that changed everything. The story begins not in Egypt, but in Persia, with a substance called mimia. This was a naturally occurring bitumen, a black, tar-like substance that oozed from specific mountainsides in regions around the Dead Sea and parts of Persia. For generations, this mineral pitch had been used in traditional Islamic medicine to treat fractures, wounds, and various ailments. It was valued, effective, according to contemporary understanding, and importantly, it was rare. When Arab physicians like Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi in the 9th and 10th centuries wrote about mumia in their medical texts, they were describing this natural bituminous substance. The word itself came from the Persian mum, meaning wax, referring to the waxy, pitch-like consistency of the material. During the Crusades of the 11th and 12th centuries, European soldiers and travelers encountered this medicine for the first time. They heard Arab physicians praising mumia for its healing properties, particularly for broken bones and internal injuries. Naturally, Europeans wanted access to this wonder drug. The problem was in the translation. When medieval Latin translators got their hands on Arabic medical texts, they encountered the word mumia. They knew it referred to something black, something preserved, something connected to the dead. And here's where things went catastrophically wrong. The translators looked at Egyptian mummies with their black, resinous coating from the embalming process and made a terrible assumption. They concluded that mumia must be the substance extracted from these preserved bodies. One particularly influential mistranslation came from Simon of Genoa around 1300. When translating the work of the Arab physician Serapion the Younger, Simon wrote that mumia was the substance found in the land where bodies are buried with aloes and myrrh, mixed with the liquid of the human body. Another translator, Gerard of Cremona, declared that mumia was created when the liquid of the dead, mixed with the aloes, is transformed. These weren't minor misunderstandings. They fundamentally changed what Europeans thought they were supposed to be consuming. Instead of natural bitumen from Persian mountains, they now believed they needed the preserved remains of Egyptian corpses. The medical rationale. Why corpses? To understand why educated Europeans, including physicians and scientists, accepted this practice, we need to step into the medical worldview of the time. Medieval and early modern medicine operated on principles very different from our own. One of the most influential was the doctrine of sympathetic magic, or the principle that like cures like. If you had a headache, you should consume something from the head, preferably a human skull, ground into powder. If you suffered from internal bleeding, you needed to ingest something that contained blood, ideally human blood. If you had weak bones, you required bone meal from human skeletons. The logic seemed sound to contemporary thinkers. The human body could heal itself, so consuming parts of other human bodies would transfer that healing power. This wasn't considered cannibalism in the minds of most practitioners. Cannibalism, they reasoned, was eating human flesh for sustenance or out of savagery, something they associated with distant tribes and accused others of practicing. This was medicine. This was science. The fact that it involved consuming human remains was, in their view, fundamentally different. The ancient physicians lent their authority to the practice as well. Galen, the influential Roman physician whose works remained authoritative through the medieval period, had mentioned the curative effects of consuming burnt human bones for epilepsy and arthritis. Paracelsus, the renowned Swiss physician and alchemist of the early 16th century, actively promoted the medicinal use of human remains, including mummy, human blood, fat, marrow, and even excrement. When such respected figures endorsed these practices, questioning them became difficult. If Galen said it worked, if Paracelsus prescribed it, who was a local apothecary or physician to disagree? The mummy rush. Emptying Egypt's tombs once Europeans decided that Egyptian mummies were the source of powerful medicine. The inevitable happened. They started raiding tombs. What followed was one of history's most systematic destructions of archaeological heritage, driven not by treasure-seeking tomb robbers, but by medical demand. Merchants in Alexandria and Cairo quickly recognized the commercial opportunity. They began excavating burial sites, breaking apart mummified remains, and shipping the pieces back to Europe. The trade was so lucrative that by the 16th century, mummy fragments were available in apothecaries across Germany, France, Italy, and England. The scale of this trade was staggering. Entire burial grounds were systematically emptied. Workers would enter tombs that had lain undisturbed for thousands of years, crack open sarcophagi, unwrap the carefully preserved bodies, and break them into transportable pieces. The mummies weren't treated as human remains or archaeological treasures. They were inventory, commercial goods to be processed and shipped like any other commodity. The logistics of the mummy trade were complex. Egyptian merchants needed to extract the bodies from sometimes remote tomb sites, transport them to port cities, and prepare them for the long sea voyage to Europe. This meant breaking larger mummies into smaller pieces that could be packed efficiently into ships' holds. Heads, limbs, and torsos were separated. The most valued parts were the areas with the most preserved tissue and the darkest resinous coating, as these were believed to be the most potent medicinally. The demand was insatiable. According to historical records, ships regularly departed Egyptian ports loaded with hundreds of pounds of mummified remains. In 1586, the English merchant John Sanderson reported purchasing 600 pounds of mummy parts, including diverse heads, hands, arms, and feet, which he shipped back to England for the medical trade. This was just one merchant on one voyage. Multiply this across decades of trade, across dozens of merchants, across hundreds of voyages, and the scale of destruction becomes apparent. European apothecaries couldn't keep mummy medicine in stock. As soon as shipments arrived, they would be purchased and distributed. Wealthy customers would order specific quantities for their personal use. Physicians would stock up to prescribe to patients. Even middle-class households might keep a small supply of mummy powder for emergencies. The medicine appeared in locked cabinets alongside gold and jewels, valued both monetarily and medicinally. But there was a fundamental problem. Egypt couldn't produce authentic ancient mummies fast enough to meet European demand. The supply of genuine mummified bodies, even from a civilization as old as Egypt's, was finite. Egyptian authorities tried to stop the trade. In 1428, officials in Cairo arrested and tortured mummy smugglers who confessed to boiling bodies and selling the oil that rose to the surface. But enforcement was sporadic and easily circumvented with bribes. As authentic mummies became scarcer and prices rose, the inevitable happened. Enter the forgers and the opportunists who realized they could manufacture mummies that Europeans couldn't distinguish from the genuine article. The counterfeit corpse trade by the mid-16th century. The mummy trade had become so profitable that enterprising criminals began manufacturing fake mummies. The process was disturbingly simple. They would acquire recently deceased bodies, sometimes from executed criminals, sometimes from hospitals, sometimes from sources best left unexamined. These fresh corpses would be dried in ovens, sometimes wrapped in linen, and artificially aged to look like genuine ancient Egyptian mummies. The French royal surgeon Ambroise Père discovered this fraud firsthand during a visit to Alexandria in the 1590s. He encountered a merchant who openly admitted to creating fake mummies. The man expressed surprise that Christians, who seemed so dainty-mouthed, would eat dead bodies at all. He personally collected recently deceased individuals, dried their corpses using heat, and sold them as ancient Egyptian mummies to European buyers who couldn't tell the difference. Père was horrified, not necessarily by the practice of consuming human remains, but by the deception. He had personally prescribed mumia to patients hundreds of times, believing he was giving them genuine ancient medicine. Now he realized much of what circulated in Europe was fraudulent. But even this revelation didn't stop the trade. It merely added a new concern. Were you getting authentic Egyptian mummy or merely preserved peasant? The fraud extended beyond Egypt. In France, unscrupulous apothecaries were caught stealing the bodies of executed criminals from gallows, drying them in ovens, and selling them as mumia. The barber surgeon Ambroise Père documented this practice happening in French cities, where bodies would be processed in secret and then mixed with herbs and wine to create tinctures sold as medicine. What the rich were really swallowing. The preparation of mumia varied, but most recipes followed a similar pattern. Apothecaries would take mummified tissue, typically the black remnants found in the skull and abdominal cavities, and scrape them out. This material would be placed in large vessels and mixed with various ingredients. Common recipes called for combining the mummy powder with herbs, wine, or vinegar. The mixture would be left to steep, sometimes for days or weeks, before being strained and bottled. The resulting liquid was dark, foul-smelling, and according to those who tasted it, absolutely revolting. But desperate people consumed it anyway, because their physicians told them it would cure everything from plague to headaches to heart conditions. King Charles II of England was perhaps the most famous consumer of corpse medicine. He created his own personal remedy called the King's Drops, which consisted of human skull powder mixed with alcohol. He kept this concoction with him constantly and would take doses whenever he felt unwell. This was the King of England, one of the most powerful men in Europe, carrying around powdered human skull like a modern person might carry aspirin. The wealthy could afford the most expensive varieties of mumia, supposedly from the most authentic sources. Prices were calculated based on presumed authenticity, with genuine Egyptian mummy commanding premium costs. The very rich sought out mummies that were supposedly from pharaohs or other royalty, operating under the belief that consuming royal dead would be more powerful than consuming common dead. Royalty eating royalty seemed fitting to the aristocratic mindset, but mumia wasn't just for the rich. By the 17th century, various grades of mummy medicine existed at different price points, making it accessible to a wider range of people. The poor might only afford the cheapest, most questionable varieties, but they bought it nonetheless, hoping it would cure their ailments. Not just mummies. The expansion of corpse medicine, the practice didn't stop with Egyptian mummies. Once Europeans accepted the principle that human remains possessed healing properties, the practice expanded to include fresher sources. Paracelsus and other physicians of the 16th and 17th centuries argued that fresh corpses might actually be more effective than ancient ones. Their reasoning? Ancient mummies had lost their vitality over millennia. Fresh bodies, on the other hand, still contained the life force, the spark of existence that made them powerful medicine. This led to a new, even more disturbing trade: fresh corpse medicine. The ideal source, according to medical texts of the period, was a healthy young man, preferably around 24 years old, ideally red-headed, who had died suddenly, usually by execution or accident. The sudden death was important because physicians believed the spirit would remain trapped within the body longer, giving it greater healing power. Executioners became secondary suppliers in the corpse medicine trade. They would sell fresh blood from the scaffold to people suffering from epilepsy, who would drink it warm immediately after an execution. They sold fat rendered from executed criminals' bodies, which was used to treat wounds and bruises. They sold powdered bone and skull fragments. Human fat, in particular, was considered excellent for external applications. It was rubbed directly on wounds, used to treat bruises, and applied to bandages before dressing injuries. The logic was simple. Human fat was the body's natural protection, so using it externally would transfer that protective property. Blood was consumed for various conditions. There was an ancient Roman belief, never quite abandoned in Europe, that gladiators' blood could cure epilepsy. This evolved into the practice of epileptics drinking blood from executed criminals, fresh from the scaffold. The warmer, the better, according to medical advice of the time. Powdered skull became the go-to treatment for neurological conditions. Headaches, migraines, dizziness, even more serious conditions like apoplexy, stroke, were treated with skull powder. Sometimes it was mixed with chocolate to make it more palatable. Sometimes it was mixed with molasses or treacle. As late as 1847, an English medical case recorded a man being advised to mix a young woman's powdered skull with treacle to treat his daughter's epilepsy. He followed the prescription. It didn't work. The slow death of a practice. By the 18th century, the practice of consuming mumia and other corpse medicines began to decline, though it persisted in isolated cases well into the 19th and even early 20th century. Several factors contributed to its downfall. First, advances in anatomical knowledge and medical science gradually eroded the theoretical basis for corpse medicine. As physicians gained better understanding of how the body actually functioned, the principle of sympathetic magic became less convincing. The idea that consuming skull would cure headaches started to seem less like sound medical practice and more like superstition. Second, the rise of chemistry and pharmaceutical development provided alternatives. New medicines based on mineral and plant compounds proved more effective and more palatable than ground-up corpses. When you can take a pill that actually reduces your symptoms without requiring you to swallow human remains, most people will choose the pill. Third, changing attitudes toward human dignity and the sanctity of the dead made the practice increasingly uncomfortable, even for those who might have accepted its medical efficacy. The Enlightenment brought new philosophical frameworks that emphasized individual rights and human dignity, making it harder to justify treating corpses as raw materials for medicine. But the practice didn't disappear overnight. In Germany, mumia was still occasionally offered for sale in pharmacies as late as the early 20th century. The last recorded instance of someone consuming human blood as medicine occurred in 1908, when it was taken at the scaffold. According to historian Richard Suggs' research, the hypocrisy no one wanted to discuss. Perhaps the most striking aspect of Europe's corpse medicine tradition is the staggering hypocrisy it revealed. While Europeans were literally consuming human remains by the shipload, they simultaneously used accusations of cannibalism to justify colonial expansion and the subjugation of indigenous peoples in the Americas, Africa, and the Pacific. European explorers, missionaries, and settlers routinely described native peoples as savage cannibals. using these accusations as moral justification for conquest and conversion. The logic went, these people eat human flesh, therefore they are barbaric. Therefore, we are justified in conquering them and forcing civilization upon them. But Europeans were eating human flesh too. They were just calling it medicine. The French essayist Michel de Montaigne spotted this contradiction as early as 1580. In his essay on cannibals, he argued that Brazilian ritual cannibalism was no worse than Europe's medical cannibalism, and both were preferable to the religious wars tearing Europe apart at the time. His voice, however, was largely drowned out by the clink of coins in apothecary tills and the thunder of colonial expansion. The difference, as it turned out, wasn't in the act itself, but in who got to define what counted as civilized. When Europeans consumed human remains, it was science. When indigenous peoples did it, it was savagery. The distinction had nothing to do with actual practice and everything to do with who controlled the narrative. When medicine became entertainment, the mummy unwrapping craze, even as the practice of consuming mummies for medicine began to decline in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Europeans found new, equally disturbing ways to use Egyptian dead for their entertainment. The Victorian era saw the rise of mummy unwrapping parties, social events where Egyptian corpses were unrolled before audiences for amusement and spectacle. Napoleon's expedition to Egypt in 1798 had sparked renewed European fascination with ancient Egyptian culture. Suddenly, Egypt wasn't just a distant source of medical ingredients. It was a subject of intense scientific and popular interest. Wealthy European travelers began visiting Egypt, and many brought back souvenirs. The most impressive souvenir? An entire mummy. By the early 19th century, Egyptian street vendors openly sold mummies to tourists. The trade was so common that travelers could negotiate prices, haggle over condition, and have their purchases shipped home like any other commodity. An 1875 photograph shows an Egyptian street mummy seller with his wares displayed like produce at a market. Back in England and across Europe, these mummies became centerpieces for social gatherings. The most famous unwrapper was Surgeon Thomas Pettigrew, who conducted mummy unwrappings at the Royal College of Surgeons in London, starting in the 1830s. These events had at least a veneer of scientific respectability. Pettigrew would lecture on Egyptian embalming techniques, analyze the preservation methods, and make observations about the deceased's health and status. But as mummy unwrapping grew popular, it moved from medical colleges to private drawing rooms. Wealthy hosts would invite friends and social acquaintances to witness the unwrapping of an Egyptian mummy as evening entertainment. The events became increasingly theatrical, with dramatic lighting, music, and commentary. Attendees would dress in their finest clothes, drink champagne, and watch as thousands-year-old human remains were exposed for their amusement. The unwrapping process itself was often destructive and disrespectful. Hosts would tear through layers of linen wrappings, sometimes damaging the mummy beneath in their haste to reveal what lay inside. Spectators would crowd close, examining the desiccated flesh, commenting on the preservation, speculating about who this person had been in life. Sometimes hosts distributed pieces of the mummy to guests as party favors. Small fragments of wrapping, bits of jewelry found with the body, even pieces of the mummy itself would be handed out as souvenirs. Guests would take these fragments home, keeping them as curiosities to display in their own homes or show to friends. The practice reached such extremes that in one recorded instance, a host served the party refreshments on the open sarcophagus, using a 3,000-year-old coffin as a buffet table. In another case, attendees played parlor games around the unwrapped mummy, treating the human remains as mere decoration for their evening's entertainment. These unwrapping parties represent a particularly disturbing intersection of colonialism, scientific curiosity, and entertainment. The Europeans who attended these events didn't see themselves as disrespecting the dead. They saw themselves as sophisticated, educated people engaged in a fascinating cultural and historical experience. The fact that they were treating human remains as party entertainment didn't register as problematic in their minds. The practice continued well into the late 19th century. Modern recreations of these events have attempted to capture the atmosphere. One such recreation in London at St. Bartholomew's Hospital featured everything from playing Walk Like an Egyptian by the Bangles on loudspeakers to plying attendees with gin. While the mummy in the modern recreation was just an actor in bandages, the event highlighted the macabre nature of the original practice. The legacy of mummy consumption. This medicinal cannibalism represents one of history's stranger chapters. A reminder that practices we find abhorrent today were once not only accepted but actively promoted by the educated elite. It shows how easily humans can rationalize almost anything if the right authorities endorse it. How desperation for cures can override basic revulsion, and how our understanding of what's ethical changes dramatically over time. Thousands of mummies were destroyed, ground up, and consumed. Each one represented not just a body, but a connection to the past, a piece of history, a story that would never be told. The mummy of Tutankhamun survived only because Howard Carter found his tomb in 1922, long after the mummy-eating craze had ended. How many others weren't so lucky? How much knowledge disappeared into European stomachs? We'll never know. Today, the illegal antiquities trade, including mummies, is still worth an estimated $3 billion. Mummies are still bought and sold on black markets. They're still exploited, still treated as commodities. The lure of the ancient and exotic continues. Even if we've mostly stopped grinding them into medicine, the practice left scars beyond the destroyed bodies. It established patterns of viewing non-European cultures as resources to be exploited rather than peoples to be respected. It normalized treating the dead as commercial goods if those dead were foreign and ancient enough. These attitudes didn't disappear with the end of mummy medicine. They evolved into new forms of cultural appropriation and exploitation that continue today. The Mad Hatters. When fashion demanded madness while Europeans were consuming Egyptian corpses, another industry was quietly poisoning its workers through a process that seemed, on the surface, far more innocent: making hats. But the seemingly simple craft of transforming animal fur into fashionable felt headwear concealed a toxic secret that would leave thousands of workers trembling, paranoid, and quite literally mad. The phrase "mad as a hatter" didn't come from Lewis Carroll's imagination. It came from the streets, workshops, and hospitals where people witnessed the real victims of an industrial process that valued style over human health. Why mercury? The chemistry of fashion. To understand why hat makers poisoned themselves, we need to understand what felt is and why it was so desirable. Felt is a textile created not by weaving, but by matting and pressing fibers together. When done correctly, felt is dense, durable, water-resistant, and perfect for making hats that hold their shape. But there's a problem. Animal hair doesn't naturally want to mat together easily. Before the 17th century, European hat makers used various methods to prepare animal fur for felting. They worked primarily with fur from rabbits, hares, and beavers. The process involved separating the soft underfur from the coarser outer hairs, then getting these fibers to stick together. One common method involved using urine, which contained urea that helped break down the fur's outer layer, making it more pliable. But then, French Huguenot hat makers, Protestant refugees who fled to England after religious persecution in France, brought with them a revolutionary new technique. They had discovered that mercury, specifically in the form of mercuric nitrate, made the fur incredibly soft, pliable, and easy to felt. The mercury solution roughened and twisted the individual hairs at a microscopic level, causing them to mat together more easily and create a superior, more durable felt. The process, called carroting, because the mercuric nitrate solution turned white fur a reddish-brown color, involved treating the animal pelts with a diluted mercury solution. The fur would be painted or dipped in this solution, then dried in an oven. Once dry, the pelts would be stretched over a cutting machine, and the treated fur would be sliced off in thin shreds. These shreds of mercury-treated fur would then be layered onto a conical mold, where they would be pressed and shrunk with steam and hot water. This is where the real danger began. When the mercury-treated felt was heated with steam, it released mercury vapors into the air, and the hat makers, working in small, poorly ventilated workshops, breathed in these vapors day after day, year after year. The result was a felt of unprecedented quality. The hats held their shape perfectly, resisted water, and could be fashioned into the stylish top hats, bowlers, and other headwear that defined gentlemen's fashion from the 17th through the 19th centuries. The method was so effective that it spread throughout Europe and eventually to America, where cities like Danbury, Connecticut, became major hat-making centers. But the workers who made this possible were paying a terrible price. The symptoms. A gradual descent mercury poisoning doesn't happen overnight. It's insidious, creeping into the body vapor by vapor, accumulating in the tissues, and gradually destroying the central nervous system. The hatters who worked with mercury experienced a progression of symptoms that would slowly rob them of their physical and mental health. The early signs were subtle enough that workers might not immediately recognize them as connected to their occupation. They would begin to experience headaches, persistent and nagging. They might notice their hands trembling slightly, particularly when trying to perform fine motor tasks. Their sleep would become disturbed, interrupted by strange dreams or simple inability to rest properly. As exposure continued, the tremors would worsen. What started as a slight shake in the hands would progress to what became known as Hatter Shakes or the Danbury Shakes. Named after the Connecticut city where hat making was a major industry, these tremors weren't limited to the hands. Workers' eyelids would twitch, their lips would quiver, their tongues would shake, making speech difficult and sometimes slurred. The tremors created a vicious cycle. As workers' hands shook more, they struggled to perform the delicate work required in hat making. Their productivity dropped. Their employers grew frustrated. The workers themselves felt ashamed and inadequate, not understanding that their deteriorating performance was caused by occupational poisoning rather than personal failing. Some would try to hide their tremors, clenching their hands or avoiding tasks that required steady hands. This denial only prolonged their exposure to the toxin causing the problem. The physical symptoms were distressing, but the neurological and psychological changes were even more disturbing. Workers would develop what physicians called erethism, a cluster of psychological symptoms that included pathological shyness, marked irritability, difficulty concentrating, and memory problems. Hatters who had once been sociable would become withdrawn, avoiding social interactions, unable to make eye contact. They would become irritable over minor issues, flying into rages at small provocations. The psychological transformation could be dramatic. A man who had once enjoyed taverns and social gatherings would begin refusing invitations, making excuses, eventually stopping all social contact. He would avoid eye contact, speak in whispers, try to make himself invisible. His family would notice him becoming paranoid, suspicious of others, interpreting innocent comments as criticism or mockery. Their personalities would fundamentally change. Confident workers would become timid, hiding from attention. Normally calm individuals would become anxious and jumpy. Many developed a peculiar excessive shyness that made normal social interaction almost impossible. They would avoid being noticed, preferred to remain unnoticed, and exhibit a desire to hide from the world. This wasn't shyness in the normal sense. It was a pathological inability to function socially, driven by neurotoxic damage to their brains. Memory problems emerged as the poisoning progressed. Workers would forget familiar processes they'd performed thousands of times. They would lose track of conversations mid-sentence. They would struggle to remember names of coworkers they'd known for years. Some would get lost walking home from work on routes they'd traveled daily for decades. Concentration became nearly impossible. Tasks that required sustained attention, even simple ones like counting or sorting, would defeat them. They would stare at their work, unable to focus, their thoughts scattering like leaves in wind. Some workers reported feeling like their minds were full of fog, thick and impenetrable, preventing clear thought. In severe cases, after prolonged exposure, workers would experience even more dramatic symptoms. Some developed delusions or hallucinations. They might hear voices, see things that weren't there, or develop bizarre beliefs disconnected from reality. Others experienced what we would now recognize as severe depression and anxiety disorders. The despair could be crushing, leaving workers unable to see any hope or future. A few attempted suicide, driven to desperation by the constant tremors, the personality changes, and the inability to control their own bodies and minds. Physical symptoms extended beyond the neurological. Workers would lose their teeth, which would simply fall out from weakened gums. Their hair might fall out. Their fingers and toes might turn red and swollen, a condition caused by inflammation and damage to blood vessels. They would bleed from their ears and mouth. Some lost appendages entirely as tissue died from the toxic effects of mercury, a condition called gangrene. The workers knew something was wrong. They could feel themselves changing, feel their bodies betraying them. They would look at their trembling hands and wonder how they could control them. They would notice their changed personalities and mourn the loss of who they'd been. But for most of the 18th and 19th centuries, they had little choice but to continue working, because hat making was their livelihood, their skill, their profession. Quitting meant poverty, starvation, homelessness. So they continued, breathing in the vapors, absorbing the poison, slowly destroying themselves one working day at a time. Family members watched this transformation with horror and helplessness. Wives saw their husbands become strangers. Children grew afraid of fathers whose tempers had become unpredictable. But what could anyone do? The family needed the income. There were no worker protections, no disability benefits, no alternatives. So families endured alongside the workers, adapting to the changes, managing the rages, mourning the gradual loss of someone they loved, even as that person still lived. A day in a mercury-filled workshop. Imagine walking into a hat-making workshop in, say, 1850s London or Danbury, Connecticut. The building is small, cramped, built to maximize production space rather than worker comfort. The windows are few and small because light control matters for the work, but ventilation is an afterthought. The air inside carries a peculiar metallic tang, mixed with the animal smell of wet fur and the acrid scent of the dyes and chemicals used in the process. The room is warm, kept heated for the drying and steaming processes. Workers, mostly men, but some women, hunched over their workstations, hands moving with practiced precision. Despite the slight tremor, many of them can no longer hide. In one corner, workers apply the mercuric nitrate solution to fresh pelts, painting or dipping the fur with seeming carelessness, their hands directly in contact with the toxic liquid. In another area, treated pelts hang drying in an oven, the heat driving off moisture and releasing mercury vapor into the air. Near the center, workers operate the cutting machines, slicing the treated fur into usable material, creating clouds of mercury-contaminated dust with each cut. At the steaming stations, the real danger concentrates. Workers hold partially formed hats over steam, using the heat and moisture to shape and shrink the felt. The steam carries mercury vapor directly into their faces, into their lungs. They breathe it deep with every breath. There are no masks, no respirators, no protective equipment. The concept doesn't exist yet. These are just hats. What could be dangerous about making hats? The workers break for lunch, eating in the same contaminated space because there's nowhere else to go. They wipe their hands on their aprons, already saturated with mercury residue, and handle their food with those same hands. Mercury transfers from their fingers to their bread, their cheese, their teacups. They ingest it orally as well as through their lungs. By the end of a 10 or 12-hour workday, each worker has inhaled and absorbed countless particles of mercury. It's building up in their bodies, accumulating in their tissues, crossing the blood-brain barrier, settling into their nervous systems where it will slowly, inexorably begin its destructive work. Some of the older workers show the signs clearly. One man, perhaps in his 30s but looking older, has a pronounced tremor in both hands. He struggles to button his coat when the shift ends. Another worker speaks haltingly, his slurred speech making him difficult to understand. A younger worker, new to the trade, watches the older men with a mixture of pity and growing dread, beginning to suspect what awaits him if he stays in this profession. At night, the workers return to cramped boarding houses or small family homes. They wash, but the mercury doesn't come off easily. It's in their pores, under their nails, embedded in their hair. Their families notice the changes. Wives watch their husbands become stranger, more withdrawn, more irritable. Children learn to avoid their father's sudden anger, his inexplicable rages over nothing. The workers themselves feel it happening but don't fully understand it. They know the trade is hard on the body. They've heard the phrase "mad as a hatter" on the streets. But what choice do they have? Hat making is their skill, their livelihood. Quitting means poverty. Continuing means slowly losing their minds. When did they know? The slow recognition. The first medical description of mercury poisoning among hatters appeared in St. Petersburg, Russia, in 1829. A physician documented the strange cluster of symptoms affecting hat makers in that city, noting the tremors, the personality changes, and the neurological decline. But this report, published in Russian, had limited circulation in Western Europe and America. In 1860, Dr. J. Addison Freeman published a detailed occupational health study in the Transactions of the Medical Society of New Jersey, describing mercury poisoning among hat workers in that state. This was just 5 years before Lewis Carroll published Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, with its famous Mad Hatter character, though there's no evidence Carroll knew of Freeman's obscure medical report. In 1861, German physician Adolf Kussmaul published a comprehensive clinical description of mercury poisoning that included some references to hat makers. His work helped establish the medical understanding of mercury's effects, though it didn't immediately lead to protective measures for workers. The French Academy of Medicine demonstrated the health hazards to hat makers in 1869, presenting clear evidence of the connection between mercury use and worker illness. This led to France passing legislation in 1898 to protect hatters, requiring better ventilation and limiting mercury exposure. France was ahead of other nations in this regard. In Britain, factory inspectors began taking note of deaths and illnesses linked to mercury in the 1890s. However, British authorities never passed specific legislation addressing the issue. The problem wasn't considered severe enough to warrant dedicated laws. Instead, officials simply monitored the situation, noting cases but taking little action to prevent them. The United States lagged even further behind. In 1888, a new method using hydrochloride instead of mercury was patented, offering a safer alternative for felt production. The technology existed to eliminate the danger, but the hat-making industry, both in America and Britain, largely ignored it. Mercury worked well. It was familiar, and changing processes would require investment and training. So they continued using mercury. By 1901, a survey of hatters in Newark and Orange, New Jersey, revealed something disturbing. The bureau chief who conducted the survey found that hat manufacturers claimed to be unaware of any disease peculiar to hatters beyond tuberculosis and rheumatism. One employer remarked that working in the trade seemed to develop an inordinate craving for strong drink among workers, but didn't connect this alcoholism to mercury poisoning. This ignorance, whether genuine or willful, persisted despite abundant evidence. By 1934, the U.S. Public Health Service estimated that 80% of American felt makers suffered from mercurial tremors. 8 out of every 10 workers showed symptoms of mercury poisoning. Yet the industry continued operating as usual. Trade unions, which might have been expected to demand protections for workers, never addressed the issue effectively. The United States Hat Finishers Association formed in 1854, never made mercury exposure a campaign priority. Unlike France, America never adopted relevant legislation protecting hatters from mercury. What finally ended the use of mercury in American hat making wasn't worker protection laws or health concerns. It was war. When the United States entered World War II, mercury became a critical material for manufacturing detonators and other munitions. In December 1941, the U.S. Public Health Service convened a meeting with hat manufacturers. The government needed mercury for the war effort. Would the manufacturers voluntarily adopt alternative methods? They agreed, not because workers were suffering, not because it was the right thing to do, but because their country needed the mercury for weapons. Within months, the hat-making industry switched to hydrogen peroxide-based processes that produced excellent felt without poisoning anyone. The technology had been available for decades. It just took a world war to force its adoption. The Mad Hatter, Fiction and Reality, when Lewis Carroll published Alice's Adventures in Wonderland in 1865 and its sequel, Through the Looking Glass in 1871, featuring the eccentric character of the Mad Hatter, actually called Hatter in the second book. Readers immediately connected the character to the real phenomenon of mercury-poisoned hatters. But was Carroll actually writing about mercury poisoning? The answer is probably not, at least not directly. Carroll was well read in medical matters and likely familiar with the phrase mad as a hatter, which had been in circulation since at least 1829. But the Mad Hatter character in his books doesn't actually display the typical symptoms of mercury poisoning. Real hatters with erethism were pathologically shy, withdrawn, unable to maintain social interaction. They avoided attention and struggled with paranoia and anxiety. Carroll's Mad Hatter, by contrast, is an extroverted, confident character who hosts tea parties, makes bold statements, and shows no sign of excessive shyness or withdrawal. He's eccentric, yes, but not in ways that match mercury poisoning symptoms. Instead, Carroll almost certainly based the character on a real person, Theophilus Carter, an eccentric furniture dealer in Oxford who was well known to Carroll. Carter was called the Mad Hatter, locally because of his eccentric behavior and his habit of always wearing a top hat. He was odd, certainly, but his oddness came from his personality, not from occupational mercury exposure. That said, some scholars have argued that the Hatter's behavior in certain scenes could reflect mercury poisoning. In Through the Looking Glass, when Hatter appears as a witness at the trial of the Knave of Hearts, he displays extreme nervousness, dropping his teacup and bread and butter in agitation and struggling to testify coherently. This nervousness and trembling could be seen as consistent with Hatter's shakes. Whether Carroll intended the connection or not, the Mad Hatter became permanently associated with the real industrial poisoning that afflicted hat workers. The character helped immortalize the phrase and kept public attention on the phenomenon, even as the industry continued poisoning workers for decades after the books were published. The regional variations. Danbury, London, and beyond, the mercury poisoning phenomenon affected hat-making regions differently based on local industries, regulations, and awareness. Danbury, Connecticut, became so associated with the problem that mercury-induced tremors were commonly called the Danbury Shakes. Danbury emerged as a major American hat-making center in the 19th century. At its peak, the city produced millions of hats annually, employing thousands of workers in dozens of factories. The industry brought prosperity to the town, but it also brought illness. Local physicians became intimately familiar with the progression of mercury poisoning, seeing case after case of workers with the same constellation of symptoms. The tremors became so common that they were simply accepted as part of the trade, like blisters for blacksmiths or back pain for dock workers. Workers would joke grimly about the shakes, treating it as an inevitable consequence of their profession rather than a preventable industrial disease. In England, hat-making centers like London, Manchester, and areas of the Midlands saw similar patterns. British hatters exhibited the same symptoms. the same progression from subtle tremors to full neurological collapse. But British attitudes toward the problem were somewhat different from American ones. British factory inspectors did monitor the situation and document cases, even if they didn't ultimately pass protective legislation. In France, which had brought the mercury carroting process to widespread use, authorities proved more willing to intervene. The French approach reflected broader continental European attitudes toward worker protection, which tended to be somewhat more proactive than Anglo-American approaches. The 1898 French law requiring better ventilation and limiting exposure represented real progress, even if it came too late for thousands who had already been poisoned. Germany continued selling mumia and allowing mercury use in hat-making well into the 20th century, showing how industrial and commercial interests could override health concerns even in scientifically advanced nations. The last of the Mad Hatters, by the mid-20th century, mercury had been completely eliminated from hat-making in most of the developed world. The industry shifted to alternative processes that produced equally good or better felt without the toxic side effects. Hydrogen peroxide, in particular, proved an excellent substitute, matting fibers effectively without releasing dangerous vapors. The phrase "mad as a hatter" persisted in the language long after people forgot its origins. It became a colorful expression for eccentric behavior, disconnected from its source in industrial poisoning. When Johnny Depp portrayed the Mad Hatter in Tim Burton's 2010 film, Alice in Wonderland, he made the choice to depict the character with flamboyantly colored hair and fingernails, and erratic behavior that seemed to reference mercury poisoning. In an interview, Depp explained, "I think the Mad Hatter was poisoned. Very, very poisoned. And I think it just took effect on all his nerves. It was coming out through his hair, and through his fingernails, through his eyes." Today, mercury exposure in developed nations is primarily a concern in other industries. Dental offices with amalgam fillings, certain manufacturing processes, broken thermometers and fluorescent lights, and consumption of fish contaminated with methylmercury. The specific phenomenon of hatters being driven mad by their profession has ended, remembered now mainly through a literary character and a lingering phrase. But for the thousands who suffered through it, who felt their hands begin to shake, their personalities change, their minds gradually slip away, it was devastatingly real. They made the hats that defined fashion for generations, and they paid for that fashion with their sanity, their health, and often their lives. Their story stands as a reminder that every industrial product, every consumer good, every fashionable item may carry invisible human costs, borne by workers whose names we'll never know, whose suffering enabled our comfort. Sailors' starvation, the grim reality below decks. If mercury poisoning was a slow death and mummy consumption was a bizarre choice, the sailor's diet in the 18th century was simply survival at its most desperate. Life at sea during the Age of Sail meant months or even years away from fresh food, subsisting on provisions that were barely edible when loaded aboard ship and steadily declined into something far worse. The romantic image of sailing ships and adventure on the high seas rarely mentions what sailors actually ate, how they stored their food, or what happened when provisions ran low. The reality was considerably less romantic and often genuinely horrifying. The standard ration, what you were promised in theory. Naval and merchant sailor rations in the 18th century were substantial. The British Royal Navy, which set standards that other navies generally followed, provided each sailor with a daily allowance that included 1 pound, approximately 450 grams of ship's biscuit, also called hardtack, 1 gallon of beer, over 3 liters, or half a pint of rum watered down, or a pint and a half of wine. Weekly rations added 2 kilograms of salt beef, 1 kilogram of salt pork, a liter of dried peas 5 liters combined of oatmeal and wheat, 170 grams of butter, 340 grams of cheese on paper. This represented more food than many working-class people received on land. The caloric content was substantial, designed to fuel men performing hard physical labor in often brutal conditions. The British Navy, in particular, was known for providing relatively reliable rations compared to other navies of the period. French sailors, especially after the French Revolution, often faced much worse conditions due to supply problems and corruption. But the reality of these rations bore little resemblance to their bureaucratic description. The quality of food, the methods of preservation, and the conditions of storage all conspired to turn these theoretical rations into something far less appetizing and far less nutritious than the list suggested. Hardtack, the eternal biscuit ship's biscuit, universally known as hardtack, formed the foundation of the sailor's diet. Made from flour, water, and a small amount of salt, these thick, hard crackers were baked until they became nearly indestructible. The baking process removed almost all moisture, which prevented them from molding or spoiling quickly. A properly made and stored hardtack biscuit could theoretically last for years. The problem was that edible and not spoiled were two very different things. Hardtack was legendarily hard. Sailors couldn't simply bite into it. The biscuits were so dense and tough that attempting to chew them directly risked breaking teeth. Sailors' journals and memoirs are filled with references to the jaw-breaking nature of ship's biscuit. Some compared the texture to wood. Others claimed you could use hardtack as a building material. The jokes about its hardness weren't really jokes. They were barely exaggerated truth. Instead of chewing, sailors developed various techniques for consuming hardtack. They would suck on pieces, gradually softening them with saliva over extended periods. They would soak pieces in water, beer, or their weak broth to make them soft enough to chew. They would crush them and mix the crumbs into other foods. Some sailors learned to soften hardtack by dipping it in their daily rum ration. Freshly made hardtack was at least plain and neutral in flavor, if impossibly hard. But hardtack was rarely fresh. Most ships carried biscuit that was already months or years old when loaded, because the Navy and merchant companies stored it in bulk and used the oldest supplies first. As hardtack aged, it became home to various creatures. Weevils, small beetles that infest grain products, were the most common inhabitants. These tiny insects would burrow into the biscuits, lay eggs, and create entire colonies within the hardtack supplies. Eventually, each biscuit would contain dozens or even hundreds of weevils in various life stages: eggs, larvae, pupae, and adults. Sailors developed the habit of tapping their hardtack pieces against the table or the side of their plate before eating, trying to dislodge the weevils. The insects would emerge from the holes they bored and fall out. Most of the time, sailors would then brush off what weevils they could see and eat the biscuit anyway. Weevils and all. There wasn't much choice. It was hardtack or nothing, and even weevil-infested hardtack provided calories. Some accounts suggest sailors preferred to eat hardtack at night in the dark, because they couldn't see the weevils that way, and it was easier to pretend they weren't there. Others reported sailors joking that the weevils added protein to their diet, which was grimly true. Cockroaches also infested ship's biscuit, reducing entire crates of hardtack to crumbs and debris. When cockroach populations got out of control, which happened regularly in the warm, damp conditions below decks, they could devastate food supplies. Sailors would wake to find roaches crawling across their faces, through their hammocks, over their eating utensils. The insects were impossible to eliminate and simply became another unpleasant fact of life at sea. The phrase hardtack itself became synonymous with food that was barely edible, almost too bad to eat. But sailors ate it anyway, day after day, month after month, because it was what they had. Salt pork and beef. When meat becomes wooden meat preservation in the 18th century, relied on one primary method: salt. Enormous quantities of salt. Pork and beef were slaughtered, butchered, and then packed in barrels with so much salt that the meat would become thoroughly saturated. The salt drew out moisture through osmosis, creating an environment where bacteria couldn't survive and the meat wouldn't rot. In theory, this worked. salted meat could last for extended periods without refrigeration. In practice, the results were often barely recognizable as food. The best salted meat, freshly prepared and properly stored, was edible if you soaked it extensively to remove the excess salt, then boiled it thoroughly. But most sailors never encountered best salted meat. They got whatever had been sitting in the ship's hold for months or years, exposed to heat, dampness, and the general filth of shipboard conditions. Salted beef, after long storage, became black and hardened like wood. Sailors joked that it resembled black oak more than food. Some reported that the meat was so hard and resistant that sailors would carve it into buttons, belt buckles, and other useful items. Whether they actually wore hardened salt beef as accessories or this was naval humor is debatable. But the fact that such stories circulated tells you something about the meat's condition. When sailors attempted to cook this ancient salted meat, they faced a frustrating problem. The salt content was so high that the meat needed to be soaked in fresh water for hours or even days before cooking to leach out enough salt to make it even theoretically edible. But ships had limited fresh water, which was needed for drinking. Using precious water to soak meat seemed wasteful. So often, sailors would attempt to boil the heavily salted meat with minimal or no soaking. The result was barely chewable, unbelievably salty, and bore little resemblance to meat. One account from 1705 described sailors dealing with meat that had been in salt so long that boiling it caused it to shrink by half. The sailors, seeing how much they lost to shrinkage when cooking it, decided to eat it raw instead. They consumed raw, heavily salted beef and pork for the remainder of their voyage. Salted pork fared somewhat better than beef, but not much. Pork fat helped preserve it and added some flavor. But pork also spoiled faster than beef, particularly in hot climates. Sailors in the Caribbean or sailing along the African coast often found their pork rations had turned rancid, giving off a putrid smell. They ate it anyway, because there was no alternative. The most charitable description of standard naval salted meat came from period accounts that called it tough, leathery, black, hard, and resistant to both teeth and digestion. Less charitable accounts used words that probably shouldn't appear in a family-friendly script. The scourge of scurvy. When your body eats itself, of all the afflictions that plagued sailors, scurvy was the most devastating and the most preventable, though they didn't know it at the time. Scurvy is caused by severe vitamin C deficiency. The human body cannot produce or store vitamin C, so we need a regular dietary intake of it. Without vitamin C, the body gradually falls apart at a cellular level. Early symptoms of scurvy included fatigue, weakness, and irritability. Sailors would feel perpetually exhausted, unable to perform their duties with their usual vigor. They would become moody and depressed, which was often attributed to homesickness or poor morale rather than nutritional deficiency. Captains and officers would interpret these early signs as laziness or insubordination, punishing sailors who were actually suffering from the first stages of a deadly disease. As scurvy progressed, the symptoms became more dramatic and disturbing. Gums would become swollen, spongy, and begin to bleed. At first, this would happen during eating or when brushing teeth, if sailors had any way to clean their teeth at all. But as the condition worsened, the gums would bleed spontaneously, filling sailors' mouths with blood throughout the day and night. The gum swelling would become so severe that the tissue would actually grow over the teeth, which would then begin to loosen in their sockets. Sailors would feel their teeth shifting when they tried to chew. Eventually, the teeth would simply fall out, sometimes several at once. The pain was excruciating. Many sailors with advanced scurvy couldn't eat solid food even when it was available, because their mouths were too damaged and painful. Old wounds would reopen spontaneously as the scar tissue broke down. A sailor who had been injured months or even years earlier would suddenly find that healed wounds splitting open again, as if the injury had just occurred. The body, lacking vitamin C, couldn't maintain the collagen that held tissues together. Scars were among the first structures to fail. New wounds wouldn't heal at all. A minor cut or scrape would fester and spread instead of closing. The edges of the wound would become ragged and infected. What should have been a trivial injury could become a life-threatening infection because the body had lost its ability to repair damaged tissue. Bruises would appear all over the body without any injury occurring. Blood vessels, weakened by collagen breakdown, would rupture spontaneously under the skin. Sailors would wake up covered in purple and black bruises they couldn't explain. The bruising would spread and darken, sometimes covering entire limbs in discoloration. Their legs would swell massively with fluid retention, a condition called edema. The swelling would be so severe that sailors couldn't wear their shoes or move normally. The swollen legs would be painful to touch and made walking agonizing when walking was still possible. Joints would become intensely painful. Every movement hurt. Sailors with scurvy would lie in their hammocks, unable or unwilling to move, because even the slightest motion sent waves of pain through their deteriorating bodies. The joint pain came from hemorrhaging inside the joints themselves, as blood vessels leaked and tissues broke down. Skin problems developed that went beyond bruising. Sailors would develop rough, discolored patches all over their bodies. Their skin would become dry and scaly. Open sores would appear and refuse to heal, becoming sites of infection. The overall appearance of a sailor with advanced scurvy was horrifying, their skin a patchwork of bruises, sores, and discoloration. In advanced stages, scurvy caused truly horrifying symptoms that witnesses struggled to describe without horror. Blood would leak from every mucous membrane in the body. Sailors would bleed from their ears, with blood trickling down the sides of their heads. They would have constant nosebleeds that couldn't be stopped. Their eyes would develop subconjunctival hemorrhages, creating pools of blood in the whites of their eyes that made them look monstrous. They would cough up blood as their respiratory tissues broke down. Blood would appear in their urine as their kidneys began to fail. They would have rectal bleeding. Essentially, every opening in the body would leak blood as the cardiovascular system collapsed. Internal organs would begin to fail as the tissues that held them in place and maintained their structure degraded. The heart, which requires vitamin C to maintain its muscle tissue, would weaken. Sailors would experience irregular heartbeats, shortness of breath, and chest pain as their cardiovascular systems failed. The final stages of scurvy were mercifully brief, though no less terrible. Sailors would become delirious, their minds failing along with their bodies. Some would hallucinate. Others would slip into unconsciousness. Finally, after weeks or months of deterioration, scurvy would kill them through a combination of internal bleeding, organ failure, infection, or simply the body's complete inability to function any longer. Death from scurvy was not quick or peaceful. It was a prolonged agony as the body systematically broke down. Sailors watched themselves decompose while still alive, knowing what was happening but powerless to stop it without access to fresh food. The tragedy multiplied when you consider how common scurvy was. On some voyages, 50% or more of the crew would die from it. On particularly long voyages, or those that encountered prolonged calms or navigation errors, the death toll could be even higher. Ships would arrive in port with only a handful of living sailors aboard, the rest having perished from scurvy during the journey. The losses from scurvy likely exceeded all other causes of death at sea combined during the age of sail. More sailors died from scurvy than from storms, combat accidents, and all other diseases together. It was the silent killer, the invisible enemy that struck from within after weeks at sea. The tragedy is that scurvy was completely preventable and relatively easy to cure. A steady intake of fresh fruits and vegetables, particularly citrus fruits, would prevent it entirely. The vitamin C in these foods maintained the body's ability to produce collagen and maintain tissues. Even sailors deep into advanced scurvy, barely able to move, could recover relatively quickly if given fresh food, especially fruit. There are documented cases of sailors at death's door from scurvy, making remarkable recoveries after being given oranges or lemons. Within days, the bleeding would stop. Within a week, new tissue would begin to form. Within 2 weeks, they would be able to walk and work again. The transformation was so dramatic, it seemed miraculous to observers who didn't understand the underlying cause. But for most of the 18th century, navies and merchant companies failed to understand or systematically implement this simple solution. Part of the problem was that the medical understanding of scurvy was confused and contradictory. Different physicians proposed different causes: bad air, lack of exercise, drinking contaminated water, psychological factors, excessive consumption of salt. The true cause, vitamin C deficiency, wouldn't be understood until the 20th century. Even when empirical evidence showed that fresh food prevented scurvy, the lesson wasn't always learned or applied consistently. Captain James Cook famously kept his crews healthy during his Pacific voyages in the 1770s by providing fresh food whenever possible. He would stop at islands to gather fruits and vegetables. He required his crew to consume what he called scurvy grass, various edible plants rich in vitamin C. His meticulous attention to diet meant his voyages had remarkably low death rates from scurvy. But Cook himself didn't fully understand why his methods worked. He attributed his success to cleanliness, fresh air, and various foods including sauerkraut, which was actually effective because the fermentation process preserved vitamin C. He knew empirically that his approach prevented scurvy, but he couldn't explain the mechanism. British naval physician James Lind conducted careful experiments in 1747 that proved citrus fruits could cure scurvy. He divided sailors suffering from scurvy into groups and gave each group different treatments. Only the group receiving citrus fruits recovered. His findings were published and well documented. Yet the British Royal Navy didn't systematically implement lemon or lime juice rations until 1795, nearly 50 years after Lind proved their effectiveness. Even then, implementation was inconsistent. Many merchant ships and other navies continued to lose men to scurvy well into the 19th century. Cost concerns, misunderstandings about what counted as effective citrus, and simple institutional inertia meant that sailors continued dying from a completely preventable disease for decades after the cure was known. The British Navy's adoption of lime juice rations eventually led to British sailors being nicknamed limeys, a term that persisted. Long after the practice that inspired, it became standard maritime procedure worldwide. But those lime juice rations came too late for the hundreds of thousands of sailors who had already died from scurvy in the centuries before. When the food runs out, survival eating standard rations, however terrible, were at least predictable. Sailors knew they would get their pound of weevily hardtack and their chunk of wooden salt beef. But on voyages that went wrong, when ships were becalmed for weeks, when navigation errors extended journeys beyond planned durations, when shipwrecks stranded crews in lifeboats, when provisioning was inadequate from the start, sailors faced a grim progression of increasingly desperate food sources. When the standard rations ran out or became completely inedible, sailors turned to anything organic they could find. The progression generally went something like this. First, they would consume anything edible that hadn't been counted as official rations. Rats became food. Ships were always infested with rats, which lived in the holds eating the same provisions the sailors ate. Hungry sailors would hunt them, setting traps or catching them by hand. Accounts described rat meat as nice and delicate, full as good as rabbits. Whether this was genuine assessment or desperate optimism is unclear. Seabirds that landed on the rigging became targets. Sailors would catch gulls, albatrosses, or any other bird foolish enough to rest on the ship. The meat was often described as oily and unpleasant, but it provided protein when nothing else was available. Any animal on board became potential food. Ships sometimes carried cats to control rat populations. When rations failed, the cats would be killed and eaten. Pets, mascots, any living creature was fair game. There are accounts of sailors consuming pigeons that had been kept for carrying messages. After the animals were gone, sailors turned to less obviously edible items. Leather became food. Boot leather, belts, leather clothing, even leather parts of the ship's equipment would be cut into small pieces. The leather would be soaked in water to soften it, then boiled for hours to make it barely chewable. Sometimes it would be fried in whatever fat or oil could be found. One account from 1759 describes a ship's captain discovering a pair of leather shorts in his cabin after the crew had eaten everything else. The shorts were cut into squares and distributed to the crew, who survived another 20 days on this miserable allowance. Candles, made from tallow, animal fat, became food. Sailors would eat them despite the fact that they were mixed with wax and other materials that made them barely digestible. The fat content provided calories, which was all that mattered. Some ships carried soap, which was technically made from fats and therefore theoretically edible. Desperate sailors consumed it. Wooden objects would be chewed on in hopes of extracting any nutritional value. Sailors would gnaw on wooden buttons, belts, handles, anything that might offer the slightest sustenance or at least the psychological comfort of having something in their mouths. In 1765, the American ship Petty drifted for months after a severe storm destroyed all means of navigation. The crew ate all their provisions, then consumed their tobacco, lamp oil, candles, and leather. When even these ran out, they were faced with a terrible choice: starvation or cannibalism, the custom of the sea, when humans became food. The most horrific aspect of maritime starvation was the practice that became known as the custom of the sea: cannibalism through drawing lots. This was not random violence or sudden madness. It was a systematic, ritualized practice with its own rules and procedures, developed over centuries of shipwrecks and disasters at sea. The custom specified that all other food sources must be completely exhausted first. Sailors were required to eat every scrap of regular food, every rat, every bird, every piece of leather, every candle, every remotely edible substance before considering cannibalism. Only when literally nothing else remained, when starvation was genuinely imminent and death a certainty, could they proceed to the final, terrible option. If there were already dead bodies available from disease, exposure, or injury, these were to be consumed first before killing anyone specifically for food. Many documented cases of maritime cannibalism involved eating people who had already died from natural causes. The distinction mattered enormously in the legal and moral framework sailors understood. Eating the already dead was considered less heinous than killing specifically for consumption. Only when all the dead had been eaten and starvation remained imminent could the crew consider killing someone specifically for food. At this point, the custom required that lots be drawn. The process was formalized, almost ritualistic. Everyone would participate in a lottery, creating what was considered a fair chance for each person. The lottery would determine two things: who would die to feed the others, and who would carry out the execution. The method of drawing lots varied. Sometimes it involved drawing straws of different lengths. Sometimes marked pieces of paper or wood. Sometimes other random selection methods. But the principle remained constant. Pure chance decided who lived and who died. The shortest lot meant death. The next shortest meant the terrible duty of becoming executioner, of being the one to kill a fellow crew member to save the others. This randomness was considered crucial to the moral and legal acceptability of the practice. It meant no one was being murdered for personal reasons, no vendettas being settled, no weak being victimized. Chance alone decided who would live and who would provide sustenance for the survivors. The acceptance of one's lot, even if it meant death, was considered a fundamental part of the custom. If the lottery was conducted fairly, with everyone having an equal chance, and all proper procedures were followed, this was considered legally acceptable under maritime law for much of the 18th and early 19th centuries. Courts and the public generally recognized that extreme necessity justified extreme measures. Sailors who survived through cannibalism and openly admitted to it often faced no legal consequences, provided they could demonstrate they had followed the custom properly. The case of the whaling ship Essex, rammed and sunk by a whale in the Pacific Ocean on November 20th, 1820, provides one of the most thoroughly documented examples of the custom of the sea in practice. After the ship sank, 20 survivors were left floating in 3 small whaleboats, hundreds of miles from any land with minimal provisions. As days turned to weeks, the survivors consumed their meager rations, then caught and ate what little sea life they could. When starvation became severe, they began dying from exposure and malnutrition. The first to die were consumed by their surviving shipmates, carefully butchered and distributed among the boats. Eventually, even the dead were gone, and the survivors faced the terrible reality that more would need to die if any were to survive. On January 27, 1821, in one of the boats, lots were drawn. Owen Coffin, a 17-year-old cabin boy and cousin of the ship's captain George Pollard, drew the shortest lot. The captain, horrified that his young cousin had been selected, immediately offered to take Coffin's place. But Coffin, displaying remarkable courage and acceptance, refused. "I like my lot as well as any other," he reportedly said, accepting his fate with stoic dignity. Charles Ramsdell drew the second shortest lot, meaning he would have to be the executioner. After waiting a few minutes to give Coffin time to prepare himself mentally, Ramsdell shot him through the head with a pistol. The crew then carefully butchered Coffin's body and distributed it among themselves. His flesh sustained them for several more days. In another boat from the Essex, 2 more men died and were eaten. In total, 7 crew members were consumed during the ordeal. Only 8 of the original 20 survivors lived to be rescued. When they were finally picked up by passing ships, they freely admitted to cannibalism, including the lottery and the killing of Owen Coffin. They faced no legal consequences because they had followed the established custom. The case of the Peggy in 1765 shows a darker side of the custom. After the American schooner was disabled by a severe storm on its return voyage from the Azores, the crew drifted for months, consuming all provisions and then moving on to wine, brandy, a pigeon, a cat, tobacco, leather, and candles. When even these were gone, the crew told the captain they would hold a lottery to determine who should be killed to feed the others. But among themselves, the crew had already decided to kill the one enslaved African man on board. The lottery was staged to provide legal cover. The African man drew the shortest lot in what was almost certainly a rigged process. He was shot through the head. One sailor immediately ate his liver raw, a decision that would prove fatal. The sailor died 3 days later, apparently driven mad by the experience. The others pickled and cooked the rest of the body, sustaining themselves for additional days before finally being rescued. No charges were brought against the captain or crew, despite the clear evidence that the lottery had been rigged and that a specific individual had been targeted for murder. The legal system, and society more broadly, chose to accept their account at face value, demonstrating how the custom of the sea could be exploited to commit what was essentially racist murder under the cover of necessity. A similar pattern appeared in the 1766 case of the ship Tiger. After being shipwrecked and running out of provisions, the sailors decided to kill the one Negro youth on board rather than drawing lots at all. One of the survivors freely admitted this afterwards, showing no shame in the decision. The youth's body was smoked to preserve it longer, sustaining the crew for an extended period. Again, no legal consequences followed, demonstrating the deep racism embedded in maritime culture and the ways vulnerable individuals could be victimized under the guise of following custom. The legal framework supporting the custom of the sea began to change with the famous 1884 case of R.V. Dudley and Stevens. The yacht Mignonette was shipwrecked in a storm about 1,600 miles from the Cape of Good Hope. 4 men escaped in a lifeboat: Captain Tom Dudley, mate Edwin Stevens, able seaman Edmund Brooks, and 17-year-old cabin boy Richard Parker. After weeks adrift with minimal provisions, Parker fell unconscious from a combination of hunger and drinking seawater. The captain and mate, without drawing lots or consulting Brooks, decided to kill and eat him. They rationalized that Parker was already near death and unlikely to survive, so killing him would save 3 lives at the cost of one that was probably lost anyway. Brooks objected, but didn't physically stop them. Dudley killed Parker by cutting his throat with a penknife. The 3 survivors then fed on Parker's body for 4 days before being rescued by a passing German ship. When they reached port, they openly admitted to killing and eating Parker, apparently expecting the same legal treatment the previous cases of maritime cannibalism had received, understanding and acquittal based on necessity. The times had changed. The case was tried in England, and the court ruled that necessity was not a defense for murder. The judges acknowledged the terrible circumstances, but held that deliberately killing someone, even to save others, even under extreme duress, was still murder. Dudley and Stevens were convicted and sentenced to death, though their sentences were quickly commuted to 6 months' imprisonment. The ruling in Dudley and Stevens effectively ended the legal acceptance of the custom of the sea in British law and, by extension, in much of the maritime world. The practice of drawing lots to determine who would be killed for food, which had been accepted for centuries, was now clearly illegal. Sailors who survived through such means could face murder charges. This didn't necessarily mean the practice stopped entirely. It meant survivors learned to be more discreet. If cannibalism occurred, survivors were now incentivized to claim that the person eaten had died naturally rather than being killed. And indeed, in the 1890s, there were several suspicious cases where survivors claimed their deceased crew members had died from exposure or illness, but the circumstances suggested otherwise. Without strong evidence to the contrary, prosecutors and courts seemed reluctant to investigate too closely. In other countries, the defense of necessity in shipwreck cases proved somewhat more durable. Norwegian law in the 1890s saw 2 incidents where sailors drew lots and consumed victims, or killed sailors they considered close to death anyway. These cases were treated more leniently than the British Mignonette case, showing that different legal systems took different approaches to these extreme situations. The custom of the sea, in all its horrible detail, reveals something profound about human behavior under extreme stress. It shows our capacity to create rules and rituals even in the most desperate circumstances. Our need to maintain a sense of order and fairness even when committing acts we would normally find unthinkable. It also reveals the ways those rules could be exploited, how racism and power dynamics persisted even in situations of supposedly equal desperation. For sailors of the 18th and 19th centuries, the custom of the sea was simply part of the understood reality of maritime life. Every sailor knew that if their ship went down far from shore, if they found themselves adrift in a lifeboat with no hope of quick rescue, they might one day draw lots. They might draw the short straw and face death to save their shipmates. Or they might draw the second shortest and have to become executioner. Or they might survive by consuming the flesh of those less fortunate. This knowledge hung over every voyage, a dark possibility that lurked behind every storm, every navigation error, every accident at sea. It was one more way in which the life of a sailor in the age of sail was defined by constant proximity to death in its most terrible forms. Life below decks, where the food was prepared. The conditions in which this terrible food was stored, prepared, and consumed deserve examination, because they made everything worse. Most ships didn't have proper kitchens or galleys for much of the 18th century. Cooking was done on open decks using portable stoves or even fires built on sand or brick boxes. In bad weather, no cooking happened at all. Sailors would eat cold hardtack and raw salt pork while waves crashed over the decks and wind tore at the rigging. The largest ships eventually developed dedicated galley spaces, but these were small, cramped, poorly ventilated, and incredibly dangerous. A fire on a wooden ship in the middle of the ocean was one of the most feared disasters. So cooking fires were heavily restricted and constantly monitored. The cook, often disabled or injured sailors who could no longer perform other duties, would work in these spaces, preparing food for hundreds of men using primitive equipment. Below decks, where sailors lived, conditions were unsanitary by any standard. The holds where food was stored were dark, damp, and infested with rats, cockroaches, and other vermin. Water, beer, and other liquids were stored in wooden barrels that could leak, crack, or develop contamination. The water itself often became slimy and foul-tasting within weeks of departure. Sailors slept in hammocks strung so closely together they could barely move. The air below decks was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, bilge water, animal waste from livestock kept on board, and the pervasive odor of decay from food supplies and the ship itself. Ventilation was minimal. Disease spread rapidly in these conditions. Mealtimes were regimented but brief. Sailors would receive their rations, eat quickly, and return to work. There were no leisurely meals, no dining tables for common sailors. They ate standing, sitting on coils of rope, or wherever they could find space. Officers, in stark contrast, lived in different worlds, even on the same ship. They had private cabins, personal servants, and the ability to purchase their own provisions. Officer mess tables featured fresh bread baked daily, meat that wasn't blackened and ancient, vegetables when available, wine instead of rum, butter and cheese of reasonable quality. The class divide was absolute and visible in every meal. For the common sailor, eating was never about pleasure or nutrition in any meaningful sense. It was simply another hardship to endure, another challenge to overcome, another day survived on the minimum required to keep working. Conclusion: the cost of desperation. These three seemingly unrelated practices, consuming Egyptian mummies, working with mercury in hat shops, and surviving on rotting food at sea, share a common thread. They all represent what humans will do, what humans will endure, when driven by desperation, economic necessity, or simple lack of better options. Europeans ate mummies because they were desperate for cures, willing to believe that ancient corpses held medical power, and unconcerned about the humanity of those long-dead Egyptians. Hatters worked with mercury because they needed to earn a living, because the industry offered them employment, because refusing meant poverty. Sailors ate weevils, leather, and worse because the alternative was death. And survival trumps dignity when starvation looms. These practices were all eventually abandoned, not always because people recognized their horror, but often because better alternatives became available or economic circumstances changed. Mummy medicine declined as pharmaceutical science advanced. Mercury in hat making ended when the war effort needed the metal for munitions. Sailors' diets improved when canning technology developed and understanding of nutrition advanced. But for centuries, these were simply normal aspects of life. Mummy powder sat on apothecary shelves next to herbs. Mercury vapors filled hat workshops from London to Connecticut. Sailors tapped weevils out of their hardtack and considered it just another day at sea. The people who lived through these experiences, who consumed ground-up corpses, believing it would cure their headaches, who felt their hands start to shake from mercury exposure, who chewed on leather boot pieces to stave off starvation, they were not so different from us. They were humans trying to survive in a world that gave them limited, terrible options. These stories persist not because they're peculiar aberrations, but because they show us something fundamental about human adaptability and the price we pay for progress. Every comfort we enjoy, every medical advance we benefit from, every technological improvement in our lives came at a cost borne by someone. Sometimes that someone was ancient Egyptian dead, dug up and ground into powder. Sometimes it was hatters whose hands shook and minds slipped away. Sometimes it was sailors gnawing on their boots while waves crashed overhead. We remember these stories not to mock or judge those who came before, but to understand that desperation drives humans to remarkable, sometimes horrifying lengths. And perhaps to appreciate that the medicines we trust, the hats we wear, the food we eat, they all have histories, and those histories are rarely simple or comfortable. So as you drift off tonight, remember the apothecaries grinding mummy bones, the hatters breathing mercury vapor, the sailors tapping weevils from their biscuits. Remember that survival has never been gentle, that progress has never been painless, and that we stand on foundations built by people who endured things we can barely imagine. Rest well, knowing that for all its challenges, this moment in history is kinder than most that came before. And perhaps, in our small ways, we can work to ensure the moments that come after are kinder still. If this strange journey through history's darker corners helped you unwind, feel free to like and subscribe. And let me know in the comments which of these strange practices surprised you most. Now, sleep well, with the comfort of knowing that at least no one expects you to eat a mummy tomorrow.